But our contact with the other groups was so good that we still continue to work with them, and Vijay was able to persuade them to give up arms and come into the democratic process. They registered themselves as political parties.
Madam President, in our last meeting was under different circumstances. In fact, you were living in your old family house in Rosemead Place, and you were about to go to Madras to meet the militant leaders. And much water has flowed down various rivers since then. Could you just recapitulate as to what happened during that visit to Madras?
Well, that was a time when the leaders of all 5 militant groups operating in Jaffna were hiding away in Madras. And we went there to meet them. We were in the opposition politically for ourselves, because we were at that time the only party that was talking of peace and of a negotiated settlement to the war which had begun about 2 years before. And we wanted to get contact with them and see whether we could bring them into a democratic process for dialogue and all that. And we met the leaders of 4 of the 5 groups. The others were very willing to plot EPRLF, EROS, and the then newly decimated TELO, because all their cadres were killed off apparently by the LTT at that time. And we had a very good dialogue with them, to the point that it continued, and Vijay, my husband, was able to persuade 2 or 3 of those groups to come into the democratic process, to register themselves as political parties and come into the electoral process even, and they are still there. The LTT, we were very keen to meet Mr. Prabhakaran, but we didn't have the good luck of having an appointment with him. We did meet Mr. Balasingham. With difficulty we managed to get an appointment. And well, that was that. It's that kind of relationship that continued. And in fact, the meeting in Madras with the LTT also had some results, in the sense that they invited our party to come to Jaffna. We were then not in the SLFP, the main opposition party then, to which I belong now once again. We were in a breakaway party, and many delegates from our party went to Jaffna. That was the first and only time any politicians from the south were invited to Jaffna by the LTT since the war had begun.
It just occurs to me that you talked about Vijay, and we are meeting on the day when it is his death anniversary, in fact.
Almost to the hour.
Almost to the hour. And this is the 7th.
7th.
And in fact, you are going to his village later on.
Today, yes. For, in fact, we are finally interring his ashes today. All these years we couldn't, because the UNP government prevented me from doing so. I had bought this land.
Could you explain this to me a little more?
You see, I had to run away from Sri Lanka for 3 years because I was under threat by the terrorists and the children. Then I came back after 3 years and immediately negotiated to purchase this land, because that's his village, to have his mausoleum, or whatever you call it, and inter the ashes there. When they knew that I had already paid an advance and negotiated to buy it, they kept an acquisition order on that land. It belonged to a private individual. So I could do nothing until until our government took over the reins, and immediately we removed the acquisition order and I was able to go ahead. So the result is that today we are interring the ashes and building a memorial.
Well, we shall be there. We shall be there as well. Tell me, how have your talks with the LTTE progressing? I mean, I know you must have answered this question 100 times, but really, what is the substantive movement in these conversations?
Well, you see, we began talking with the LTTE soon after our government came into power, because we got a crushing mandate from the people for that, in addition to other things that they wanted us to do. We clearly told the people that we wanted to go in for negotiations with the LTTE, and they voted for us. Ours was a sort of three-pronged approach. The first was reconstruction of the North and East, which is very badly damaged by the war, by 11 years of war. And in fact, during the first part of our conversation, dialogue with them, the talks, we only talked of the reconstruction program that we were proposing. Then the second part was, of course, going into the cessation of hostilities. We have successfully started both. The cessation has now continued for 1.5 months. I would say very successfully, apart from some minor violations and one or two slightly more than minor violations, but we have been able to settle all those. And the reconstruction program had to be stopped temporarily because of the assassination of the leader of the opposition. The LTTE was accused, not by us, but by the opposition and by many others. So there was a setback of about 1.5 months. But we've restarted the dialogue, and in fact, I have written today to Mr. Prabhakaran saying that we are willing to come, our technical officers are willing to commence the reconstruction program from Monday the 20th February, and we are awaiting a reply. The letter would have gone today.
How do you communicate with him?
By letter, through the Red Cross. That's the only means of communications. But now we have set up a new method of contact, which is that we have a special kind of radio fax system which operates between the Ministry of Defense and the government agent in Jaffna, and he also conveys messages to the LTTE. But when we want letters sent, we normally use the ICRC method, the Red Cross.
But you more or less conceded that the North.
Okay. By the way, I forgot the third prong of the approach I was telling you about, which is the most crucial and the most important for all of us. That is the actual commencement of negotiations for the political settlement of the war and the ethnic issue. We have consistently been requesting the LTTE for the last nearly 2 months for dates to begin these talks, but they have not given dates. From time to time, new conditions are put forward to postpone the agreeing to the dates. As far as we are concerned, the package we are offering them, the political package, is ready. The draft of it, which is subject to alterations after discussion with the LTTE on one hand first, and then with the other Tamil groups, and then the Sinhala-based parties in the south. So we are awaiting the LTTE's reaction.
When they are enthusiastically responding to your overtures on the first and the second, and not on the third, what do you read in that?
Well, part of the analysis of how we see it, I cannot tell you now because it could be counterproductive to the process. But generally I can say the LTTE is at the moment responding mainly to pressures from their people. The people of the North, I believe, desperately and passionately want an end to the war. And I think their desire for peace has been catalyzed, especially because for the first time since independence there is a government the people of the North, the Tamil people, have expressed faith in. They believe, rightly or wrongly, that our government will deliver the goods fairly and squarely to all the people living in this country, and therefore they are not suspicious of peace anymore.
Will you?
Yes, we will.
Where's the guarantee?
Well, you see, the difference between what the previous government, especially the last one, did and what we are doing at the moment is that we sincerely want a lasting peace in the Northeast, and that we are honest in our stated objectives, which is that all the people living in this country, irrespective of race, caste, religion, creed, have equal rights to live as citizens in this country. And our biggest asset at the moment is that the people believe us.
Well, they gave you such a massive mandate. Tell me, what actually is the origin of this problem? I mean, until the 70s, there was complete harmony. There was no real... what is the genesis of this problem? Because I believe that unless you go to the genesis, sometimes the solutions are temporary.
Well, I have given it a lot of thought. In fact, I was writing a book while I was in hiding in London, which is not finished. It's about half finished, so it was a very serious study on the causes of political violence in Sri Lanka, in the south and the north. I'm not going to tell you all what I discovered then now because we don't have time, but I think in this sense, everything is highly political, in this sense that socially speaking, traditionally speaking, the Tamil and the Sinhalese people have lived very amicably together in this country for 20 centuries. Some people tend to say it is the fact that the Sinhala people fear the Tamils because there have been invasions historically far back, almost at the beginning of the Christian era in this country. But I don't think that is correct, because those were treated not as Tamil invasions but as foreign invasions. And that did not historically cause an anti-Tamil or anti-Indian feeling amongst our people. And there's lots of evidence to prove that. This is a much more recent problem. On one hand, there are economic reasons for it. Because even though the Tamil people, the Sri Lankan Tamils as they are called, and there is the Indian Tamils who work in the estates. The Sri Lankan Tamils constitute about 1-point-something million, which is about 1/16 or 1/17 of the population. Now, but disproportionately with their numbers, the Tamil people, as I think most minorities with long cultural traditions are wont to do, they educate themselves proportionately, perhaps more than the Sinhalese majority. So therefore, sometimes the competition for jobs and employment, especially the
of this problem.
Yes. I was saying there is one aspect which is competition for employment, educational facilities and all that, which is fairly sharp in a poor country like ours, where job opportunities, especially for the top jobs, are very few. The second more important reason is that both the major Sinhala-based political parties, that is the UNP and the SLFP, have historically played with this problem. They never wanted to solve it properly. They always offered all kinds of solutions, but when it suited them as far as getting votes was concerned, they would change completely from one position to another. And finally, I think the final precipitating of this whole thing into war happened entirely because of the attitude of the last UNP government. The UNP government, as you know, thought that they could solve all political problems with violence in the south, in the north, everywhere. And in as much as they used violence and terror, intimidation, killings, assassinations by paramilitary forces against us, the democratic opposition in the south, they tried to use that against the sort of nascent militant youth groups who were demanding a separate state in the north. But it didn't work because they went to India, organized themselves, came back and started the war. So I would say that definitely the UNP government, with its wrong attitudes, pushed the Tamil people to war. I will just give you one example. From about 2 weeks after they came into power, the UNP began to attack innocent Tamil people, peaceful Tamil people living in these areas. Their houses were burnt, the people were hit, some were killed. That started in 77, not in the Black July of 83. The July 83 incident was about the 5th time it happened. Earlier it was, it happened at a lower scale, and with each one it went on getting more violent. And 83, of course, was the crisis point, which pushed the young Tamil people into thinking that under a Sinhala majority government they will have no hope of a good life. And in fact, a lot of democratic minded Tamil people here financed those groups because they were so angry about what was going on. So it was definitely precipitated by the UNP government.
Tell me that you seem to have great faith in yourself and in your mandate that you will be able to arrive at some kind of a settlement with the LTTE. What exactly is the source of this faith? Because Premadasa went that far and failed. Government of India tried and failed. Why will you succeed when everyone else failed?
As I mentioned earlier, simply because we are sincere in our desire to succeed. The other governments were not. Secondly, equally important is, as I told you, the desire for the first time of the people of the north for peace. Until recently they didn't believe in peace. They thought even if there was peace, they wouldn't get their due place in this country. But now they seem to have faith and trust and confidence that our government will deliver the goods to them.
They seem to be concentrating on reconstruction and on cessation of hostilities. For political purposes, they seem to be quite happy with the status quo. I mean, that is the message I get from what you told me.
You mean the LTTE?
They want you to get involved in reconstruction. They want you to end hostilities. And as far as the political processes are concerned, the status quo is roughly what they want.
Well, but as I said, no political movement can remain static, historically. And for once, the people of the north are wanting peace, and the LTTE is very dependent for their existence politically, if not materially, on the people. And as Mr. Balasingham himself has said recently to a foreign correspondent, which was reported widely all over the world, when asked whether Mr. Prabhakaran would finally settle for anything less than a separate state, which is what we are going to offer, not a separate state, but wide devolution, Mr. Balasingham has promoted, he has agreed that it should be so. And when asked whether Mr. Prabhakaran would agree, he had said, well, the most intractable of leaders have to listen to their people. So that is one place where I agree with Mr. Balasingham.
Very interesting. You said that anything short of a separate state. Is that the
I didn't say anything short of a separate state.
That's
something short of a separate state.
Something short of a separate.
Big difference.
What is the difference?
Well, when you say anything short of a separate state, that means you are willing to give anything at all. we are willing to go up to a certain point in wide devolution.
Could you give that a little more shape? What exactly do you have
No,
in
we
mind?
can't, because the devolutionary package is still not discussed with the LTTE, nor have we made it public, so we cannot yet discuss it.
Well, if not the substantive elements in that package, maybe the conceptual framework, if you could touch on that.
Well, it is the kind of devolution that we know, the sort of devolution you have in your country, in Switzerland maybe. We have been experimenting with some kind of devolution with the provincial councils, which is very incomplete. It would go much further, and it would also deal with the problem of this
Ethnic minorities.
and also the merge of the north and eastern provinces, which has been a very difficult.
You're talking
fight to
about the
negotiate.
demarcation of districts.
Redemarcation.
How would you? What would you do?
Well, we
Sorry,
are in
what do you
fact.
say?
कट रहा है आखिरी वर्ड कट रहा है नতুन वाली कट गया ओवरलैप हो रहा है
Sorry. No, you're talking about redemarcation of districts. What would be the details of that?
You see, we are proposing different boundary lines for the eastern province, which is the one in question at the moment, because it consists of roughly 1/3 Tamil, 1/3 Muslim, 1/3 Sinhalese. The Sinhala population and the Tamil population are in geographically separable areas. The Muslims are all over, but so we are suggesting some kind of separation along the Sinhala Tamil dividing lines, and fairly peculiar but sophisticated arrangement for the Muslims, so that they can also express their separate needs and their separate identity.
Some kind of a bridge between these two sort of separate entities. Right. Now, foreigners have been used in your peace committees, and I believe more are going to be inducted. Do you see a sort of greater role for foreigners in this process?
We may, even to the point of mediation.
You will, in fact, invite mediation.
If necessary, we are not against it. But
Do
the
you-
other side has to agree, of course.
Could you elaborate the philosophy why you think mediation might be a good idea?
Well, the same reasons why mediation has been used in a lot of international problems like this by other countries.
Do you have some countries in mind that who might play this role?
Well, it would very definitely be some neutral Western country.
Why can't it be a neutral Eastern country?
It causes a lot of political problems, and the LTT is also not happy about it.
Mhm. So LTT and you have to agree on this best. What, do you have Canada in mind?
You're putting words into my mouth.
Canada?
Not necessarily. It could be any one of those countries.
Norway?
I can't tell you what it is at the moment.
But you're talking to the government. You're already talking to the government, who might function as mediators at the end of the day.
We're thinking of it.
Right. You have talked of giving an Asian and a sort of South Asian orientation to your foreign policy. What in effect does that mean?
Well, you see, in the past 17 years, under the last government, we had no direction at all for our foreign policy. Previously, under the previous SNFP governments, it was very clearly directed towards the non-aligned movement and kind of alliance of the third world. Now that has also, that sort of perspective is weakening at the moment for reasons that we all know. The bipolar world has changed. The boundaries that were there earlier are all sort of dissolving, and new alliances are happening. And we believe in the present sort of unipolar world that regional alliances are extremely important, especially with a country like India in the region, which, though poor by the usual criteria used for definition of the term, is very rich in technology, in scientific development, in industrial advancement, and obviously has one of the largest markets in the world. So we believe that all the smaller nations like us, together with a country like India, could forge very propitious alliances for all concerned.
Are you talking of SAARC, or are you talking of some countries short of SAARC?
We are thinking of both. We know that SAARC is going to have more and more difficulties in going forward because of some of the problems between some countries in the SAARC association. So while we continue SAARC and hopefully make it more dynamic, I think we should think of bilateral arrangements and relationships between the countries.
Madam President, just the other day I was talking to Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong in Singapore, and he talked of 3 clusters of nations for the future, namely Asia, which by his definition means East Asia, Europe, the Americas. Basically, if you push him, then he talks about the Indian market and opportunities and so on. Basically, we are the sort of the blind spot in the whole of the South Asian region.
Why?
I don't know. People seem to be thinking in terms of the Southeast Asian region. They think Europe, America. We have been left out somehow. Do you share
When
that?
you say we, you mean the Indian subcontinent?
The Indian subcontinent.
I haven't noticed that particularly.
Do you hope to have some kind of an interface, say, with
But this is exactly
ASEAN?
what we say. We think that our alliances should center around the Indian subcontinent. And the Indian subcontinent must get together to form that sort of alliance. Well, SAARC is already there, but it's a bit of a non-starter up to now, probably because of the political problems between some of the countries. But I think we have a lot to do in that sense.
Do you have any practical steps in mind?
You know, we've just taken over and we had a lot of problems here. We have a vision for it, and I certainly do hope this year to begin with my visits to India, Bangladesh and some of the other countries.
When are you coming to India, madam?
Somewhere in March, towards the end of March. Dates are not yet confirmed.
Well, that would be an interesting occasion for you to outline the kind of relationships you think can be forged within the SAARC nations, if not all the SAARC nations. So, do you have in mind some compatible countries within SAARC who can form a sort of trilateral relationship?
That's a difficult question you're asking me.
Right.
Well, I don't know whether you realize that Sri Lanka is the only country in the SAARC, and perhaps the Maldives, which has no problem with any of the others. So maybe we could help effectively in solving some of these problems and getting the countries together in a more solid arrangement.
You've talked about the executive presidency as being by the 15th of July you will bring that to an end. What steps have you taken? I believe it is before a select committee, that whole project. What steps have you taken, and when, and will you be able to meet the deadline?
I think so.
What
The
exactly do you
deadline
have
is
in-
July 15th. Nothing special on that date, but we just said, like halfway through the year. At election time, we gave that promise, and we should be ready by that time with the constitutional amendments we propose to bring.
Will you be going back roughly to the situation as it was, status quo ante, or is it going to be a different
No,
set?
something in between.
Like what
But where certainly Parliament would have supremacy over everything else, as it should in a properly functioning democracy. The executive presidency would be whittled down very seriously to a nominal head of state, and the chief executive would be the Prime Minister and the cabinet, and more the Westminster style.
To go back to this role of foreigners on these peace committees, have you found them? Apparently the first group came back just the other day. What has been their reaction? What kind of feedback do you have?
You obviously don't know that they have not been permitted to work, to operate as peace committees by the LTTE. The LTTE agreed without any hesitation to our inviting these people. We even worked out certain details like their representatives of the committees, our representatives and all that. They arrived, and then when they were about to begin working, they said, hey, wait a minute, we need you to fulfill these conditions, and put forward all kinds of conditions.
Can you give an
Demands.
example of the kind of conditions?
Total lifting of the ban on fishing, which is a huge security risk because they come in their little fishing boats with arms and explosives and bang into our Navy ships. That has happened already. We have already relaxed it about 40 to 50%, but they want total relaxation of the ban on fishing. They want their cadres in the east, which is under military control at the moment, because previously the LTT was in command and we liberated those areas. There are pockets of LTT guerrillas, but they're only present minimally. They want their cadres to be allowed to walk around freely with their arms, which is also not possible, which is in fact a violation of the cessation of hostilities agreement. We have permitted certain things like that to happen because in fact there are practical problems where cadres could not come out of their hiding places. Now they are coming because there is temporary peace and they want to go and visit their families and friends and all that, and we are permitting those things to some extent. In some areas they can carry arms and go. In other areas they leave their arms in the army camp and go wherever they want and come back and collect it. But they want more than that. So the people have been here for over a month without being able to function.
So where are they cooling their heels? In which hotel here? So one can perhaps go and talk to them.
Where are they? This is not coming on record, is it? I'll tell you later, yes. We have sent them off to see the ruins at the moment, but they should be back anytime.
Right. Your Ministry of Ethnic Affairs is being inaugurated tomorrow. What is the mandate of this particular? What is the concept?
Well, the concept is there to make, because we have a clean slate. There was no such thing before. At the moment, in the long run, the concept is, of course, it's called the Ministry of Ethnic Affairs and National Integration, and it is what those words mean: designing, creating new programs in order to bring the various communities together, so that what is happening now will not happen in the future. Designing education programs, policy in other words, which will be farmed out to the various implementing ministries. That is a general thing, but at the moment their most urgent task would be the reconstruction program, peace in other words, and practically it would mean on one hand the reconstruction program, they would be handling it. There is a special presidential task force which is in charge of the reconstruction of the north. So they would be handling that from there. We would be handling special programs concerning the media, publicity, etc., to promote peace on both sides of the divide. They would also, there is already a media unit at the Presidential Secretariat, but they would operate that part of the program from there. And so many other things that would go into, and they would also handle the whole peace process, the dialogue, the letters, which at the moment are handled just by a handful of us.
From everything that you've talked of the peace process and your conversations with the LTT, I get the impression that while you have made all the efforts possible, no progress has been made. Do you think I'm valid in my assessment?
No process in the peace.
No progress has been made.
In our efforts towards peace. That is totally incorrect.
What? Give me one tangible thing that you have obtained from the LTTE.
A cessation of hostilities, for example, which has successfully lasted for 1.5 months. That's a big success within a very short time after the government came into power. We have given a lot. The lifting of the embargo, economic embargo, and so many other things. And on the whole, the fact that for the first time in 4 years, the government and the LTT have begun to talk to each other as normal human beings. In other words, bridges have begun to be built, which is the first essential need of any peace process. Then militarily